Hello there and welcome. Today I'd like to take you through the Helix THEMIS ICE demonstration. This is our intelligent migration tool that has just been released, and I'd like to step you through a couple of use cases and how you might find this tool useful to you and your organization. Just a very short word on who we are. We are Helix. We have been in the market to drive data lifecycle management in the M365 ecosystem. We are a Microsoft preferred partner, part of MISA and CoSell already, also part of the AIM organization. And today's demo is going to focus on THEMIS ICE, and that stands for Intelligent Content Enrichment. And what this product allows you to do, it essentially allows you to discover content, extract its metadata, form a ROD analysis, so you can remove redundant, obsolete, and trivial information. But you can also, before actually migrating the data, classify it with SharePoint syntax and pull out more metadata from the actual contents of the files, and then use any of the metadata that's been discovered to intelligently route it to one or more SharePoint Online locations. And these can even be in different tenants. If you happen to have a test tenant or multiple production tenants, you can absolutely do this. So what we're going to look at today, as part of the demonstration, is we're going to use a file share to discover unstructured data. We're going to perform a ROD analysis on that data. We're going to also classify that data using SharePoint syntax. We're going to modify and map the metadata, and then we're going to route it all in one stream. THEMIS ICE is a web-based application. It's installed in your private Azure tenant, and since it's web-based, it can be made available via a URL. And as you can see here, we've made it available through SharePoint. We just linked it to a page here. And then you'll notice here, this is the main interface for THEMIS ICE. And the first thing that you will notice here on the left-hand side is you'll notice there's 3 nodes enrichment workflows. That's our term for the 4 stages that the data will go through in terms of its migration. Then there's the connectors and the classification models. We'll start with the connectors. The connectors are the sources of information that we support in this release. So this is the sources of data that we can parse and bring into THEMIS ICE. And out of the box today, we have connectors for SharePoint Online. We have connectors for file shares, which is what I'm going to be showing today. And we also have a connector for SharePoint on-premises. That's SharePoint 2016. So if you have an older version of SharePoint on-premise and you want to migrate the data to SharePoint Online, as well as an Excel connector. And this allows you to put together any metadata that you can parse from a source system, and we can collate that and put that all together into the product. 2 of the really big use cases for THEMIS ICE, obviously one of them is to migrate data from multiple sources into SharePoint Online. That's our one target. However, there's another really important use case, and that is that if you've already migrated your data into SharePoint Online, but you didn't, for whatever reason, perform a broad analysis or classified any of the data, and you just lumped it in to make it available to users quickly, you could use THEMIS ICE to actually clean up all of that data and to route it into its locations accordingly. And so it's very, very important that you can actually use this tool not only to migrate data, but also to clean up existing data that is in SharePoint Online, or even to move data from a different SharePoint Online tenant into your production tenant. Now, all of this work is predicated on an enrichment workflow. An enrichment workflow, this is something that you create, that is something that runs asynchronously in the background, because some of these data collections can take a little bit of time. And so it is very important that you can start one of these and then you can leave it and then come back to it later when it is done. And the idea here is that you're starting a workflow, you're giving it a name, and in this case, we'll just do HR benefits. And this is going to look for benefit documents on an HR file share. And you will see here these connectors that are all reusable artifacts, and these are the connectors that you can use for your source data. We'll see a little bit later when you go to target to SharePoint Online, it'll show only the SharePoint Online connectors that are present. And of course, you can create a new connector on the fly if you wish to do so. I will just reuse an existing connector that we have. And I'll enter a location on this file share, and it'll parse this location. Notice down below there are instructions for what you can type in. Of course, you can use a UNC naming path. I am just doing a local share on a local server here. And the idea here is that once you've done that, you can discover the data. Now, what this discovery process does is that asynchronously, it's going to go out and look for the data that was specified. You can, of course, enclose multiple paths. I just put one. And you can see that it's going through, and this is a very small set of data. The discovery is already finished. And what it did is that it parsed all of the files that were on this file share. And not only is it presented here in the data pane, but you can also see that we've got the details. And in the details, there's two really important pieces of data here. One of them is the metadata. So we show all of what we call the discovered metadata. This is what THEMIS ICE has discovered for these documents. So because it's a file share, you're going to have a limited set of metadata available. But here is the metadata that we were able to discover. Any of this metadata can be used to either map in SharePoint. So if I want to map one of these fields to a field in SharePoint, I can do so, or it can be used or it can be used in a routing rule. So I can say if the data was created by an administrator or has a certain document extension, I can actually route it to a specific location. Now you'll notice here as well that there is a log file for each, tells you what happened with each files. It's all part of our kind of built-in audit trail that we have. You'll notice that you can filter the data. There is a log for the entire process. This one is just going to show how long that it took and that it discovered the metadata accordingly. You could also export all of this data if you wanted to. This was a very large list of data and you wanted to mine it in Excel. We allow you to export all of this data in Excel. And you'll notice here that the data here is exactly what you would expect. Columns that are of light color are the data that are shown in the view, whereas these here is the remainder of all of the data. And so with this information, you could certainly mine the data. You could send this for an approval. You could see if some of this data is correct or incorrect. And so those are all of the activities that you can do from discovery. You could also run discovery again if ever the case needs be. But the idea here is that we are moving from discovery to exclusions to classification to execution. The exclusions and classification in the middle are optional. You don't have to exclude any of the data, nor do you have to classify it. However, those are really the brunt of where you're going to get really the intelligence of the product to come into play. It's just as simple as clicking the next button to forward the enrichment workflow. We are now in the exclusion phase, as you can tell. And here's where you can apply exclusions that we have for any of the files in the list. If you click on apply exclusions, you can apply exclusions by a number of criteria, one of them being the folder or the UR paths to exclude. So for example, if you had a folder in this set of data that you didn't want to include at all, you could just create a condition there that excludes it. You can exclude by file extensions. So if we have a look at the list here, you'll notice this list here is dynamic and it is a direct reflection of the files that we have discovered. So it's not going to show you all the file types if they're not present. However, I could look at this and say immediately, oh, I'm not interested in MSG and PNG files. They should not have been in there. Of course, you may have other file types that you just do not want to migrate over for whatever reason. Perhaps they are not content that you want to manage in SharePoint Online. Perhaps they're files that shouldn't have been there. So it's just as simple as applying these. We'll add them to the list. And then you could also exclude by a minimal size. You can exclude by a maximal size. You can exclude files that were created before a certain date, modified before a certain date, or they were created by a certain author, or authors, plural. And the other thing that you can do as well is you could ferret out duplicates. Now, these are exact matches, so the contents by a checksum have to be identical, but that is how we do the duplicate exclusion. And it's just a matter of applying. And then once again, as I had mentioned, this is going to be running in the background. It is completely asynchronous. I can click away. I can go to something else, and then I can go right back to the enrichment workflow list. You'll notice that it says it's running in progress. It's just a matter of clicking on it to get back into it. And then in here, it is now completed, and it shows that 17 files are going to be included and 3 of them are excluded. And you can obviously click on the status bar. The checks are the ones that are included, whereas the little cancel sign shows the ones that are going to be excluded. And not surprisingly, this is excluded because we told it to exclude PNGs. This one here is talking about wireless headphones, obviously not something we're interested in. So that was an MSG file that was going to be excluded. And this is a duplicate file, the Excel sheet, simple sheet here, which shows up a little bit earlier in the data. So now you can go to the next stage, which is classification. And in here, you can do 2 really important things. Once again, classifying your data is completely optional. But what we leverage in THEMIS ICE at this point is we can leverage models that are created in SharePoint syntax. So these are machine teaching models where you teach via syntax, you create these models to do 2 things. To classify your data. So to say, hey, this is an HR benefit document, or this is not, or this is a tax document or an invoice. So you're teaching it to learn what the different document types are. And not only that, syntax allows you to do is to inspect the content of the document. So these are the contents of the documents, and to pull out metadata. These are called extractors. And so what you can do is you can pull out the metadata so that you can use this for tagging your information once you've put it into SharePoint Online. You could use this for routing and or tagging in the system. And so the way that we integrate here is that if you click on Apply Classification, we are integrated completely with the SharePoint Syntax Content Center that's configured. And as you can see here, there are a number of different models that are available. We show what the classification model, the name. We also show what the extracted metadata, so it's going to look at the content, and it's going to extract for anything that matches this model, the metadata. And so you can see here, we'll try this one here, which is a benefits change notice, and you'll see that there's 3 pieces of information that's going to try to extract from the contents of the document. I can select multiple models if I want to do as well, and it's going to match the content to these models if they do match. And what you can do here is simply run the classification. Now, the big distinction here is that this is running when you have not migrated any of your data whatsoever. I have not migrated any of the data to SharePoint Online. So we are using SharePoint syntax in a very unique fashion because we are pre-classifying the data on the basis of the models that are created so that you can make an informed decision, a data-driven decision as to where to migrate the data. Now, the other piece that you can do in this while this is going through is that you can also do a metadata bulk update, which will show what that is shortly after the classification is done. And that will allow you to essentially take any of the metadata that we have discovered so far and to modify it. And I'll show a good example of why you might want to do that. Okay, now that we've seen that the classification is done, a button appears where you can remove the classification, but you'll notice here that any of the documents that match the classification model, they'll show you the model that they matched as well as the confidence score. Now, if you're off in your confidence level, SharePoint Syntax has some good documentation for how to increase that and how to get a better score, and it's all predicated on getting more examples and better examples. But remember, this is for unclassified data for the models, and so you could have different templates that represent different pieces of data, and you're just essentially teaching the AI how to understand, in this particular case, what a benefit change notice is. You'll notice here that there are numerous documents that did not match the model that was specified. So these are unmatched documents. And we'll see how we use these in the future, because what you can do is you could actually take these, put these to a review in SharePoint, for example, and actually you could run THEMIS ICE again against this content by creating a different model if there was some data that was available in there that you weren't aware of. So this is all part of kind of discovering what you have. One of the things that you'll notice here for any classification model that has matched in the details now, under the all, you'll notice there's discovered metadata. This is what THEMIS ICE always discovers. So it's all the file share metadata, everything that we can discover about it. But you'll also see here extracted. Extracted is what SharePoint syntax found about the data. And so what it found about this particular document is that it matched the classification model, and not surprisingly, it has pulled out the addressee, the date of change, and the discount percentage from the actual content of the document. So we'll see that a little bit later when we migrate this into SharePoint. This is exactly what this has done. And if you click on all, you get all of the data, of course, it shows up. And for the documents that did not match anything, well, their extracted data is going to be blank. Nice and simple, they didn't match any of the models. What you can now do with the metadata bulk update here is that you have the capability as well to change the actual metadata of the files that are here. And that might be very important if you didn't have a very good naming convention, for example, and you want to impose a naming convention, or you want to prefix the data going into SharePoint with, the word archive, or you want to suffix it with different data, or you want to give it to transform the data so that there is a certain naming convention that you wish to follow, or for any piece of metadata which may be incorrect, you have the capability of altering the metadata before proceeding to the execution phase. Of course, if you can alter the metadata at its source, fine, you could always change the metadata and rerun discovery. However, that may or may not be possible or practical. And so what you can do here is you can simply export the metadata. It asks you what properties. We're just going to select them all. And you export the data. It'll export this to an Excel file. I can open up the Excel file. The Excel file is color-coded, so we show you exactly which fields that you can modify. This is also, the metadata present is going to be dependent on the source. This is a file share, so this would have the least amount of metadata, but this source could have been SharePoint Online as the source, and then you'd get all of the columns and metadata for in SharePoint Online, so you'd be able to modify a lot more. And you'll notice here that it's color-coded for the items that you can modify versus the items that you cannot, like the internal ID, you cannot modify it. If you try, we'll just ignore the values. So one of the things that you can do here is that I can, for example, if I wanted to change its file name so that I put something like archive in front of it, I could absolutely do so. I save the file, and now this has archive, and then all I have to do is now just load the file into THEMIS ICE. In order to get the changes, and there they are. So you'll notice here that it shows up under file name here. It also shows up, not surprisingly, under the details, because now this is going to be the actual file name in SharePoint now. We've actually changed that. So you could do this with any piece of metadata that we allow you to change, so that if you don't have to go back to the source. So this is yet another way of selectively tagging your information, especially if it was incorrect from the source. For example, you might have had documents that were approved and the approval status wasn't set for all of the documents for whatever reason. So you could use Excel to go in, ferret the details, select the ones that need to be approved, set the column to approved equals yes, for example, and then do the metadata bulk update to set that in the product. Now we're in measure of going to the very, very last phase, and that's execution. This is where you can take all of this data that we have, and we can selectively create rules that will allow some or all of the data to go to a specific location or to go to multiple locations. And we can allow mapping as well for the rules. And so here's where we are in the final phase called execution. And the execution, the way that this works is that this is not a one-shot deal. You can run execution multiple times. And the importance of this is that you can do a staged migration. So you could create a rule that could manage a subset of your data, run that, and then create another rule later on that will target a different subset of data and then run it. So this way you could stage it per time, you could stage it for efficiency. There are a lot of different reasons for doing a stage migration. And so we have that capability built in. The idea here is that I can create a rule that we call an action rule. And the action rule, what it's going to do is there's going to be a predicate that says, if it's this, then do this. And if it matches the content that matches the rule, we'll have all of the settings that are in the rule. So you can create one rule that will target certain pieces of files, and you can create another rule that'll have different settings and that targets a different piece of files altogether. And so then these are the ones that you can run. So as an example here, I can create an add rule. You'll notice here every rule can have a name. So I can just put up here benefits, for example, and has a priority as well, so that no rules can overlap. Yeah, so in other words, if you create a rule, the one with the lowest number in there has the highest priority, so that rules don't overlap, because a single piece of data can only match one rule or no rules. And the idea here is that if you've seen and worked with any of the Power Automate or the flow in Microsoft, it's going to look very familiar because it's kind of modeled after that. What I can do here is I can click on select a property, and not surprising, the properties come from those that were discovered and those that were extracted if it has an extracted value. And not all of the data may have an extracted value, and that's okay, it won't match. So what we'll do here is we'll say if the classification model equals, and for example, let's say I really don't know what the value is because I don't remember it, you can click on the double chevron up here that allows you to go back to the data so that you can see all of the data. And what I can do is I can see that, oh, it's classification model called benefits change notice, or I could simply go to the details and I can just do a copy and paste if I wanted to. So I could copy this, and then I can close this, and I can click back on the chevron here on the side to get back to the action rule. So it's kind of a convenience factor so that I could do things like that. Of course, you can add more conditions if you wanted to, and with ands and ors if you really wanted to get specific. But what this is going to do, it's going to say for every classification model that has this value, I now want you to do this. So our one action that's available is route to SharePoint Online. That's our target that we support in this release. You'll notice I can create a new connector, or the pull down is going to show me all the SharePoint Online connectors that have already been created. And so I can say, oh, I want to route this to the HR site. And once you've selected a connector, it'll show you the libraries that are available on that site. You could create a folder path here. So if I wanted to create a folder for this data to go in, I could do that. I could select the content type. So if you had several content types in this library, it would allow you to select a content type, one content type to match the data. And here's where you see the routing options. Okay. Now, if this were SharePoint Online, you'd have more routing options, like how do you want to handle versions? But since this is a file share and there is no such thing as versions on a file share, where we have the following routing options. You can flatten the folder hierarchy. What that simply means is that we are not going to take into account any of the folder names that the files are in. We could recreate those in SharePoint if we wanted to, so that each file is kind of a mirror of what it was on the file share. We won't do that. We'll just flatten it out. You can preserve the authors and timestamps if you wanted to, the original ones. You could also delete from the source. That's essentially a move. And then what do we do if we have duplicate file names? You could rename with a suffix, you could ignore, or you could replace them as the latest version. We'll just rename with a suffix if there are any. The library that I'm copying to is blank, so there's no files in it, but if ever there were. And here is where you can add the metadata mapping, which we call the property assignments. And it's just as simple as mapping one property to another one. So for example, once you click on this, not surprising, you see the properties that have turned up. And I can say, well, I'd like to map the addressee to the addressee as a site column in that library. And you could add another one, and I could say, well, I'm interested in perhaps the discount percentage, and I want to map that to a column called discount percentage in that library. And then it's just a matter of clicking save. The rule is saved. And then now I can click on match rules. And what this will actually do is this will go in and try and match the rules against the data. So the expectation here is that only these match because these are the only ones that have a classification model called benefits change notice, and that none of these documents would match whatsoever. And you can see that the rules have now matched. You see that there are 9 matched documents as expected. We can look here and look at the matched rule, and there are 8 unmatched documents. Now, if I were to hit execute at this particular point, it would take anything that had matched and it would now migrate it into its location that is specified in the rule. This is the hyperlink here that allows you to look into the rule as well. So I could look into the rule and see what all of the rule entails. But what you could also do at this particular point as well is you could create several rules right now if I wanted to match all of the data or to match all of the data that didn't match this particular rule. I could run this now and then create a rule later. So here we can add a second action rule that is now going to target the rest of the data. And I can use, for example, file name if I wanted to. And I could say something like not equals to blank. Of course, I could choose other rules. This is just kind of an easy way to do a catch-all. And in here, I could select a completely different tenant altogether, different site altogether, or different library altogether. And that's exactly what I'm doing. I'm going to put this into the review folder using the same connector, so the same library, but different document library, but the same site. And I'm going to put it in with as the different content type, and I can have different routing options and different metadata tagging for this data. Since I don't really know what this data is because it didn't match my model, I'm going to put it into a review folder so it can be reviewed. And it's just as simple as saving the rule. Once the rule is saved here, I can now click on match rules. And then now it should match both pieces of data. And so if you look at the rules here, you'll notice that the benefits matched all the ones that had a benefits change notice. And my second rule, which I just called rule 1, I didn't rename the rule, matches essentially the rest. And now I am in Measure, finally, to hit execute. And this will actually execute the data and put it where it belongs. So we'll run that through. And so now during the execution, once again, all of this is asynchronous, and it's just going through the queued items, and it's going to do a copy. Well, it's going to migrate the data, whether that's a copy or a move, into its intended location. And there'll be a log file and a summary at the end that'll show you where the data ended up, and I'll also show you in SharePoint what this looks like. So as you can see here, we have success on the documents. You'll notice here in the execution details, it shows you everything that was routed. We also show in the log for every single file where it was routed as well and the time. And so what does that look like on the other end? What it looks like on the other end is I routed some of the documents to this folder here called benefits. And you'll notice here that it put in, remember the one that I had changed and I added archive, it added it as a file name. It put all the other documents in there. It pulled out the addressee and the discount percentage. Now, where was it getting that information from? It was actually getting that information from the actual content of the file. And so it was pulling out the author here and the discount percentage here. Those are the only 2 fields that I happen to have mapped. I could have mapped the date of change as well. I just opted not to. So that's where it's actually getting those values from, and we use SharePoint syntax to do so. And in the review folder, you'll notice here that we opted to put all of the documents that did not match into the review so that somebody could have a look at these and see what they're all about. So in summary, what we saw today is we saw THEMIS ICE in action, doing a content discovery, a file analysis and exclusion, doing an auto classification with SharePoint syntax, and to get this intelligent content routing, we were able to create a couple of rules to route content into 2 different locations with different settings. And just in summary, THEMIS ICE allows you to do high performance migrations assisted by artificial intelligence. And these discoveries are interactive, so you can make data driven decisions. You get to see your data, you get to see the metadata, you can manipulate it, you can create rules based on the metadata that is present, and you can route this all to SharePoint Online. Or you could use this to clean up your SharePoint Online as well, because you could do all of this except that your source is SharePoint Online, and you could have a target where you're routing it to different libraries or even to a different tenant. So if you want to lock down the information, for example, to make sure that it's in its appropriate spot, or if you unfortunately did not have a very good information architecture, when you put the data in originally in SharePoint Online, but now you've developed an information architecture, THEMIS ICE is a great way to get your data into the new information architecture and to make sure that it's being properly routed. If ever you want to contact us for a personal demo, we're more than happy to do that. We're in the app source. If you want to search for Helix, you'll see a product that is up there already called THEMIS IA. That's for information architecture. It helps you create all of the artifacts in SharePoint centrally. So all the sites, all the columns, content types, manage metadata, permissions, all of that can be done centrally. You'll see that this product here that I just demoed will be making its way very soon into the marketplace. And thank you for your time. I appreciate it.